The sapphire ring felt cold against Cordelia Ashworth's trembling fingers as Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, slipped it onto her hand beneath the moonlit garden arbor. "I will wait for you," he whispered against her lips, his grey eyes burning with devotion. "No fortune, no family obligation, no force on earth will keep me from making you my Duchess." 2 years later, standing frozen in Lady Pemberton's glittering ballroom, Cordelia watched in horror as that same man announced his engagement to another woman. The sapphire ring, still hidden beneath her glove, seemed to burn like a brand of betrayal as society's most eligible bachelor chose wealth over love, duty over desire, leaving her heart shattered and her faith in promises forever broken. The sapphire ring caught the moonlight as it rested in Alexander Blackwood's palm, its deep blue depths seeming to hold all the secrets of the night sky above Ashworth Manor's ancient gardens. Cordelia Ashworth stood before him, her dark hair escaped from its careful arrangement during the evening's dancing, tendrils framing her face like spun silk in the silver light. At 18, she possessed a beauty that transcended mere physical perfection, her intelligent hazel eyes reflecting a depth of character that had captured his heart completely. The sound tones of her birthday celebration drifted from the manor house behind them, where guests still whirled across the ballroom floor in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding in the secluded rose arbor. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers, the weight of what he was about to do pressing upon his shoulders like a physical burden. He was Alexander Blackwood, 6th Duke of Ravenshollow, master of vast estates that stretched across 3 counties, yet in this moment he felt as uncertain as a schoolboy facing his first examination. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Cordelia's guardian, Edmund Ashworth, had made his disapproval abundantly clear during their brief, uncomfortable interview earlier that evening, his cold grey eyes reflecting the calculating nature that had made him one of London's most successful barristers. The man saw only Alexander's rumoured financial difficulties, not the depth of feeling that had grown between his ward and the Duke over the past year of careful courtship. What Edmund could not know, what no one could know, was the true extent of Alexander's predicament, the crushing weight of debts that threatened not only his own future, but the livelihoods of hundreds of families who depended upon his estates. Yet as Alexander looked into Cordelia's trusting face, saw the love that shone in her eyes like starlight, he pushed those dark thoughts aside and focused on this perfect moment that he would treasure for the rest of his days. "Cordelia," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you reading Shakespearean sonnets beneath the old oak tree, completely absorbed in your book while the rest of the world seemed to disappear around you. You looked up at me with such surprise, and I knew in that instant that my heart would never belong to another." She smiled, the expression transforming her already lovely face into something ethereal, and reached up to touch his cheek with her gloved hand. "And I knew that day that all the romantic poetry I had ever read paled in comparison to the reality of loving you," she replied softly, her voice carrying the musical quality that never failed to enchant him. "Your eyes held such gentleness, such strength, that I felt as though I could trust you with my very soul." He captured her hand and pressed it to his lips, tasting the saltiness of her skin through the thin silk of her gloves. "Cordelia, my darling, I know your uncle disapproves of our attachment, and I cannot blame him for his concern. A man in my position should be able to offer immediate security, a settled future without question or doubt. But I swear to you, on my honor as a gentleman and my love as a man, that I will wait for you, however long it takes to set my affairs in order, To prove myself worthy of your hand, I will wait. No other woman could ever compare to you, and I would rather live my entire life as a bachelor than settle for anything less than the love we share." The ring seemed to pulse with warmth as he slipped it onto her finger, his mother's sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had been in his family for 3 generations. "This belonged to my mother, and her mother before her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has always been meant for the woman who would be my duchess, and there has never been any doubt in my mind that woman is you." Cordelia stared down at the ring in wonder, turning her hand so that the gems caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the garden wall. "Alexander, it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, but surely your uncle will object if he discovers you have given me such a valuable token." "Let him object," Alexander replied with sudden fierceness, pulling her closer until they stood mere inches apart. "I am of age, and while I respect his position as your guardian, I will not allow anyone to dictate matters of the heart. This ring is my promise to you, Cordelia, my pledge that whatever obstacles we may face, whatever time we must endure apart, my heart belongs to you alone." When she looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy, he could resist no longer and lowered his head to capture her lips with his. The kiss began gently, reverently, but as she responded with equal passion, it deepened into something that spoke of promises and desire, and a love that neither time nor distance could diminish. Her arms wound around his neck, and he held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, which indeed she was to him. The scent of roses surrounded them, mingling with her delicate lavender perfume, creating a sensory memory that would haunt his dreams in the difficult months to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and tried to memorize every detail of this perfect moment. "Whatever the future holds, remember this night. Remember this promise," he murmured against her hair. "You are my heart, Cordelia Ashworth, and nothing will ever change that." As they stood wrapped in each other's arms beneath the ancient arbor where generations of lovers had pledged their devotion, neither could foresee the trials that lay ahead or the forces that would conspire to tear them apart. But in that moonlit garden, with the sapphire ring binding them together and their hearts beating in perfect synchronization, their love felt strong enough to conquer any obstacle, endure any separation, and triumph over any adversity that fate might place in their path. Winter's harsh grip had settled over London like an unwelcome guest who refused to depart, turning the bustling streets into treacherous pathways of ice and slush that made even the shortest journey an ordeal. In the elegant townhouse on Berkeley Square, Cordelia sat at her writing desk in the cramped morning room that served as her refuge from the cold disapproval of her Aunt Eugenia, Edmund's wife, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes missed nothing that occurred beneath her roof. 6 months had passed since that magical night in the garden at Ashworth Manor. 6 months since Alexander had slipped his mother's ring onto her finger and promised to wait for her, no matter what obstacles they might face. The sapphire now hung on a delicate chain beneath her modest mourning dress, hidden from her aunt's calculating gaze, but warm against her skin like a talisman of hope. She had written to Alexander every week without fail, pouring her heart onto paper with the passionate eloquence that came naturally when addressing the man she loved above all others. Yet not a single letter had received a reply, and with each passing day the silence grew more ominous, more inexplicable, until doubt began to creep into her heart like frost creeping across a window pane. "Dear Alexander," she wrote in her careful script, praying that this letter would somehow reach him when all the others had apparently failed, "I cannot understand why you have not responded to my previous correspondence, but I must believe there is some reasonable explanation for your silence. Perhaps my uncle has been more successful in his efforts to separate us than we anticipated. Or perhaps affairs at your estate require your complete attention. Whatever the reason, please know that my feelings remain unchanged, that I count the days until we can be together again, and that I wear your ring close to my heart as a reminder of the promises we made beneath the stars. The pen trembled in her hand as she continued, fighting back tears that threatened to betray the composure she struggled to maintain in this house, where every emotion was scrutinized and catalogued for future use against her. Meanwhile, in his study at Ravenshollow Castle, Alexander sat hunched over his ledgers like a condemned man reviewing the charges against him, the columns of figures blurring before his eyes as the magnitude of his financial catastrophe became increasingly clear. His estate manager, the reliable and unflappable Higgins, who had served the family for 30 years, stood beside the massive oak desk with the sort of expression typically reserved for funeral preparations. "Your Grace," Higgins said carefully. His weathered hands clasped behind his back. "I fear the situation has deteriorated beyond what we initially calculated. The creditors are demanding immediate payment of the outstanding loans, and without substantial capital injection within the next 3 months, we will be forced to begin selling off portions of the estate to satisfy our obligations. The tenant farmers, sir, they depend upon us for their very survival, and if we cannot maintain the properties, hundreds of families will face destitution." Alexander's head fell into his hands as the full weight of his inheritance pressed down upon him with crushing force. His father had been a brilliant man in many ways, but financial management had never been among his strengths, and the previous duke had borrowed heavily against future harvests that had failed due to successive years of poor weather and economic uncertainty. Now the sins of the father threatened to destroy not only the son but countless innocent people who had done nothing more than place their trust in the Blackwood name. "How much time do we have?" he asked without looking up, his voice barely audible in the vast room lined with portraits of his ancestors, who seemed to stare down at him with accusatory eyes. "A fortnight at most, before they begin legal proceedings," Higgins replied with evident reluctance. "There is, however, one possibility that Mr. Pemberton mentioned during his last visit. His daughter, Miss Seraphina Pemberton, is of marriageable age and possesses a dowry that would more than cover our immediate debts. Mr. Pemberton has indicated that he would be amenable to a union between your families, and indeed he suggested that such an arrangement might benefit both parties considerably." The words hit Alexander like physical blows, each syllable a nail in the coffin of his dreams and hopes for the future. Seraphina Pemberton was undeniably beautiful in the classical sense, with golden hair and blue eyes that had made her the toast of several London seasons, but she was also cold and calculating in ways that reminded him uncomfortably of a porcelain doll, lovely to look upon but utterly lacking in warmth or genuine feeling. More importantly, she was not Cordelia, would never be Cordelia, could never inspire in him the depth of love and devotion that had transformed his entire understanding of what marriage could be. Yet as he sat in his study surrounded by the evidence of his family's financial ruin, Alexander began to comprehend the true impossibility of his situation. To marry Cordelia would mean condemning her to a life of genteel poverty as his estates crumbled around them, forcing her to watch as families who had served his family for generations were turned out of their homes because of his inability to provide for them. To marry Seraphina Pemberton would mean betraying the most sacred promise he had ever made, breaking the heart of the woman he loved more than his own life, but it would also mean preserving the livelihoods of hundreds of innocent people who had committed no sin other than trusting in his ability to protect them. As snow began to fall outside his window, each flake like a tear shed by heaven itself, Alexander realized that honor sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, and that loving someone truly might mean letting them go, even if it destroyed him in the process. The crystal chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's ballroom cast their brilliant light across the assembled cream of London society, each faceted jewel throwing rainbow patterns across silk gowns and polished dancing slippers as the evening's festivities reached their peak. Cordelia stood near the edge of the dance floor, her modest lavender silk gown a stark contrast to the magnificent displays of wealth and fashion that surrounded her. Yet she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark during these torturous months in London under her aunt's cold supervision. The sapphire ring lay hidden beneath her gloves, its weight both a comfort and a torment as she maintained the pleasant expression that society demanded while her heart slowly withered from Alexander's inexplicable silence. She had attended this particular gathering with reluctance, knowing that Lady Pemberton's entertainments were always grand affairs where the most significant announcements of the season were made, but her aunt had insisted with the sort of steely determination that brooked no argument. The evening had proceeded much as expected, with the usual parade of eligible bachelors seeking dance partners and ambitious mothers positioning their daughters for advantageous matches, until Lady Pemberton herself took to the small dais at one end of the ballroom and raised her jeweled hand for silence. "Distinguished guests," Lady Pemberton announced in her carefully cultivated voice that carried the authority of one who had ruled London society for nearly 3 decades. "I have the honor to share with you the most delightful news that has blessed our family." Her smile was triumphant as she gestured toward the edge of the crowd where a magnificent figure emerged, tall and devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored evening clothes, his dark hair gleaming in the candlelight as he moved with the unconscious grace that had always marked him as different from ordinary men. "It is my great pleasure to announce the engagement of my beloved daughter, Miss Seraphina Pemberton, to His Grace, Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow." The words struck Cordelia like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into her heart until she felt as though she might collapse from the sheer impossibility of what she was hearing. Around her, the ballroom erupted into polite applause and excited murmurs as society processed this unexpected but undeniably brilliant match. Yet she remained frozen in place, watching in growing horror as Alexander stepped forward to accept the congratulations of the assembled guests. He looked magnificent and terrible, his face a mask of controlled composure that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. Yet for one devastating moment, their eyes met across the crowded room, and she saw the raw anguish that he fought to conceal. Beside him stood Seraphina Pemberton, a vision in ice-blue silk that perfectly complemented her golden hair and porcelain complexion, her smile radiating satisfaction as she acknowledged the praise and envy of her peers. There was something calculating in those perfect blue eyes as they swept the crowd, and when they found Cordelia standing like a statue amid the swirling celebration, Seraphina's smile deepened with unmistakable malice. This was no coincidence, no sudden decision made in the heat of passion or the urgency of practical necessity, but a carefully orchestrated revelation designed to cause maximum pain and humiliation. The beautiful Miss Pemberton had known exactly who would be present tonight, had planned this moment with the precision of a military campaign, and was now savoring her victory with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had successfully cornered its prey. Cordelia forced herself to breathe, to maintain the serene expression that had become second nature during her months of social exile, even as her world crumbled around her with each passing second. She could feel the eyes of the other guests upon her, some filled with pity, others with cruel curiosity, as they waited to see how the poor relation would react to this devastating blow to whatever foolish hopes she might have harbored. The sapphire ring seemed to burn against her skin beneath its concealment, a brand of shame and broken promises that mocked her naive faith in love and constancy. Yet even as her heart shattered into 1,000 irreparable fragments, Cordelia summoned the strength that had sustained her through years of dependence and uncertainty. The quiet resilience that her parents had instilled in her before their untimely deaths had left her at the mercy of others' charity. She would not give these people the satisfaction of witnessing her complete destruction, would not allow Seraphina Pemberton the triumph of seeing her rival collapse in public humiliation. With movements that appeared perfectly natural to any casual observer, she made her way toward the refreshment table, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman and lifting it to her lips as though she had not a care in the world. The liquid tasted like ashes, but she forced herself to swallow, to nod and smile at the appropriate moments as other guests offered their observations about the surprising match. "How romantic it must be," whispered Lady Hartwell to her companion. "Though I confess I always thought His Grace seemed rather devoted to some mysterious lady from the countryside." "Perhaps it was merely a summer flirtation," replied her friend with the sort of knowing smile that suggested she relished the opportunity to dissect other people's romantic disappointments. A man in his position must ultimately choose with his head rather than his heart, and Miss Pemberton is undeniably a superior match in every practical regard. The hours that followed passed in a haze of forced normalcy as Cordelia endured the remainder of the evening with the stoic determination of a soldier facing enemy fire, smiling and conversing and dancing with partners whose names she forgot the moment they spoke them, all while the devastating reality of Alexander's betrayal burned through her consciousness like acid. When her aunt finally declared their departure, Cordelia followed her to their carriage with grateful relief, settling back against the velvet cushions and closing her eyes as though she could somehow shut out the memory of what she had witnessed. Yet Aunt Eugenia was not finished with her torture, and as their carriage rolled through the darkened streets toward Berkeley Square, she began to speak with the sort of calculated cruelty that had made her feared throughout London society. "Well, my dear, I trust tonight's entertainment has finally opened your eyes to the realities of your situation," she said with false sympathy that fooled no one. "His Grace has chosen as any sensible man would choose, securing his family's future with a bride who brings both beauty and fortune to the match. You were naive to imagine that a few stolen moments in a garden could lead to anything more substantial than a brief dalliance." Cordelia kept her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, refusing to give her aunt the satisfaction of a response. But Eugenia was far from finished with her revelations. "Of course, Edmund has been instrumental in helping His Grace see reason," she continued with evident satisfaction. "When the Duke's financial difficulties became known to certain circles, your uncle took it upon himself to ensure that no inappropriate correspondence reached you that might have complicated matters unnecessarily. A gentleman in such circumstances needs to make practical decisions without the distraction of sentimental attachments that serve no useful purpose." The truth hit Cordelia with the force of a physical blow, and her eyes flew open as she stared at her aunt in growing comprehension. Edmund had intercepted her letters, had deliberately prevented any communication between herself and Alexander, had orchestrated this entire separation with the cold precision that had made him so successful in legal matters. Every week she had poured her heart onto paper. Every day she had waited for some word that would explain his silence, and all the while her own guardian had been systematically destroying any chance of reconciliation or understanding. Yet even this devastating revelation paled beside the greater truth that now blazed through her consciousness with blinding clarity. Alexander had chosen to marry another woman, had broken his sacred promise and betrayed the love they had shared, had proven that her uncle's cynical assessment of masculine nature was entirely accurate. No amount of interference could have forced him to abandon her if his devotion had been genuine. No external pressure could have overcome true love if it had ever really existed. She had been nothing more than an amusing diversion, a romantic fantasy that he had abandoned the moment practical considerations demanded his attention, and she had been fool enough to believe in promises that meant nothing to the man who made them. By the time their carriage reached Berkeley Square, Cordelia had made a decision that would reshape the entire course of her future, a resolution born from the ashes of her shattered dreams and tempered by the bitter wisdom that came from complete disillusionment. She would never again place her happiness in another person's hands, would never again allow herself to be vulnerable to the casual cruelty of those who viewed love as a luxury they could afford to discard when more pressing matters demanded their attention. If she was truly alone in the world, dependent on no one but herself for security and contentment, then she would forge a life that required nothing from anyone else, that could not be destroyed by broken promises or betrayed trust. The naive girl who had danced in moonlit gardens and believed in fairy tale endings had died tonight in Lady Pemberton's ballroom, and in her place stood a woman who understood that survival required strength, independence, and the absolute refusal to hope for anything beyond what her own efforts could provide. 2 years passed with the relentless precision of a clock marking time that could never be recovered. 2 years during which Cordelia transformed herself from a heartbroken girl into a woman whose reputation for intelligence, discretion, and quiet competence had made her one of the most sought-after companions in London society. She had refused her uncle's grudging offer of continued charity, choosing instead to seek employment with families who valued education and refinement in those who guided their children's development. Her first position with Lady Worthington had led to recommendations that opened doors to increasingly prestigious households, until she found herself established as companion to the elderly Dowager Countess of Bramhall, whose sharp wit and extensive library provided both intellectual stimulation and genuine affection that helped heal the wounds that Alexander's betrayal had left upon her soul. She had moved through these 2 years with deliberate purpose, building a life that was entirely her own creation, free from the interference of scheming relatives or the false promises of faithless lovers. Her modest but comfortable apartments in a respectable boarding house provided the independence she craved, while her work offered both financial security and the satisfaction of knowing that her efforts made a meaningful difference in the lives of those she served. The sapphire ring had long since been sold to provide the initial capital for her new life, though the memory of the promises it had represented remained buried deep in her heart like a splinter that time had never quite managed to dislodge. She rarely thought of Alexander Blackwood anymore, or told herself that she rarely thought of him, though sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn she wondered whether he had found happiness in his marriage to the beautiful Miss Pemberton, whether he ever remembered the girl who had loved him with such foolish devotion, whether the practical considerations that had driven his choice had proven sufficient to sustain him through the years of compromise and calculation that such unions required. Meanwhile, at Ravenshollow Castle, Alexander moved through his days like a man serving a life sentence for crimes he could neither deny nor fully explain, managing his estates with competent efficiency while his marriage to Seraphina provided all the financial security and social advancement that their respective families had desired. She was everything that a duke's wife should be, beautiful and accomplished, and perfectly versed in the intricate demands of their elevated position, yet their relationship remained as cold and formal as a business partnership designed to maximize mutual benefit while minimizing emotional risk. They maintained separate bedchambers and separate interests, coming together only when social obligations demanded a united front, and Alexander often wondered whether this hollow existence was the price that all men of his station paid for the privilege of preserving their ancestral responsibilities. In his private study, hidden in a locked drawer that Seraphina never troubled to examine, he kept the few letters from Cordelia that had somehow escaped Edmund's interference, along with a small portrait that he had commissioned during those golden weeks when their love had seemed capable of conquering any obstacle. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, he would read her words again and remember what it felt like to be loved completely and without reservation, to believe that two hearts could beat in perfect harmony despite the chaos and calculation that surrounded them. Yet such indulgences were dangerous luxuries that he could rarely afford, and he had learned to bury his regrets beneath layers of duty and resignation that protected him from the constant ache of what might have been. It was therefore with considerable surprise that both Alexander and Cordelia received invitations to a house party at Thornfield Park, the estate of Lord and Lady Pembroke, whose connections to both families made their inclusion natural enough, while their mutual ignorance of each other's attendance promised an encounter that neither could have anticipated or prepared for adequately. The ancient oaks of Thornfield Park stretched their gnarled branches against the October sky like the arms of elderly dancers frozen in eternal performance, their golden leaves creating a tapestry of warmth that belied the chill in the autumn air as carriages rolled up the circular drive, delivering guests to Lord and Lady Pembroke's celebrated house party. Cordelia sat quietly in the corner of the hired coach, her travelling dress of deep emerald wool, modest yet elegant, her composure carefully maintained as she contemplated the week ahead in the company of people whose world she had once thought to join as an equal rather than as a paid companion to the aging Lady Thornbury. 2 years had wrought remarkable changes in her appearance and bearing, transforming the naive girl who had believed in garden promises into a woman whose quiet confidence spoke of hard-won independence and strength forged in the fires of disappointment and betrayal. Her figure had matured into graceful curves that no amount of modest dressing could entirely conceal, while her face had acquired the sort of refined beauty that came from intelligence and experience rather than mere youth and hope. She had accepted Lady Thornbury's invitation to accompany her to this gathering with mixed feelings, knowing that such events often brought together the very people she had spent 2 years learning to forget, yet unable to resist the opportunity to see how the other half of her former world had fared in the time since she had been cast out of paradise through her own foolish romanticism and others' calculated interference. As their carriage drew to a halt before the imposing facade of Thornfield Park, Cordelia gathered her reticule and prepared to face whatever ghosts might await her in the grand halls and manicured gardens of one of England's most magnificent estates. The butler who greeted their arrival possessed the sort of dignified bearing that came from decades of service to the highest echelons of society, and he directed them toward the main drawing-room where afternoon tea was being served to the assembled guests with all the ceremony that such gatherings demanded. Cordelia followed Lady Thornbury into the elegant chamber, her eyes automatically cataloguing the faces of people she recognized from her brief season in London, while carefully maintaining the pleasant expression that had become second nature during her years as a paid companion. It was then, as she turned to accept a cup of tea from a passing footman, that she saw him standing near the tall windows that overlooked the formal gardens, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon light in a way that made her breath catch in her throat, despite all her careful preparation for this possibility. Alexander looked exactly as she remembered, yet utterly transformed. His dark hair, perhaps slightly longer than fashion dictated, his shoulders broader than they had been in his youth, his face marked by lines of experience and perhaps suffering that had not been there during those golden weeks when she had believed their love could overcome any obstacle the world might place in their path. He wore his evening dress with the unconscious elegance that had always distinguished him from other men, yet there was something in his bearing that spoke of weariness, of battles fought and won at costs that might have proven too dear to calculate. Beside him stood his wife, the former Miss Pemberton, now Her Grace the Duchess of Ravenshollow, resplendent in silk and diamonds that proclaimed her status as one of the most envied women in England. Her golden beauty undimmed by 2 years of marriage, and her smile as perfectly calculated as ever as she held court among the other ladies of their circle. The moment Alexander's eyes found Cordelia across the crowded room, the carefully controlled mask he had perfected during these years of public performance slipped just enough to reveal the shock and something deeper, more complex, that flashed through his dark gaze before he mastered himself once again. For an instant that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply stared at one another across the space that separated them. Two people who had once shared dreams and promises and passion beyond description, now divided by circumstances that had proven stronger than love, and choices that could never be undone, regardless of regret or longing. The moment shattered when Seraphina followed her husband's gaze, and her own eyes narrowed with immediate recognition and calculation, her beautiful face hardening into lines of displeasure as she realized that her comfortable world was about to be disrupted by the presence of the one woman who had ever possessed Alexander's heart completely and without reservation. "My dear Duchess," Lady Thornbury was saying as she approached their small group with Cordelia in tow, "how lovely you look this afternoon. And Your Grace, I trust you remember my companion, Miss Ashworth, whom I believe you encountered during your engagement season some years ago." The introduction was performed with the sort of casual social grace that revealed nothing of the emotional earthquake occurring beneath the polite surface. Yet Alexander's slight bow and murmured acknowledgement carried undertones that only Cordelia could interpret, while her own curtsy and cool response gave no hint of the turmoil raging in her breast as she found herself face to face with the man who had shattered her faith in love and constancy. "I trust you have been well, Miss Ashworth," Alexander said, his voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing inappropriate, while his eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite all her efforts to remain unmoved by his presence. "Indeed, Your Grace, I have found great satisfaction in my current situation," Cordelia replied, with the sort of dignified composure that proclaimed her independence more clearly than any amount of defiance could have managed, "and I hope your own circumstances have proved equally agreeable." The conversation continued along these painfully proper lines for several more minutes, each word chosen with exquisite care to convey nothing that might be construed as improper, while dancing around the enormous emotional chasm that yawned between them like a wound that had never properly healed. During the days that followed, Cordelia moved through the elaborate social rituals of the house party with the grace and competence that had made her such a valued companion. Yet she found herself constantly aware of Alexander's presence in ways that both frustrated and disturbed her carefully constructed equanimity. He seemed to appear wherever she walked in the gardens, lingered near whatever drawing room she occupied with Lady Thornbury, and managed to position himself within hearing distance whenever she engaged in conversation with other guests, though he made no overt attempt to approach her privately or force unwelcome encounters upon her notice. It was through these overheard conversations that she began to piece together fragments of information that cast her own experiences in an entirely different light, whispered comments about the Duke's financial difficulties during his engagement period, speculation about family pressures and obligations that had influenced his choice of bride, hints about the sort of debts and responsibilities that could drive even the most devoted lover to make impossible choices between personal happiness and duty to others who depended upon his decisions. Lady Worthington, her former employer who had arrived the previous day, proved particularly enlightening during an afternoon stroll through the rose gardens, when she remarked with characteristic bluntness that she had always thought it tragic how young men of fortune were forced to sacrifice their hearts for the sake of their estates and dependents. The poor Duke seemed positively haunted during his engagement, she confided to Cordelia, as they paused beside a marble fountain whose gentle splash provided cover for their conversation. One heard whispers that his estates were mortgaged beyond belief, that hundreds of tenant families faced destitution if he could not secure immediate relief through an advantageous marriage. Not that it excuses abandoning true affection, of course, but one does understand the impossible position such circumstances create for a man of honor and conscience. These revelations stirred emotions in Cordelia that she had thought safely buried beneath layers of resignation and hard-won independence, forcing her to reconsider the narrative of betrayal and abandonment that she had constructed to explain Alexander's behavior during those agonizing months of silence and uncertainty. Perhaps his choice had not been the casual discarding of inconvenient sentiment that she had imagined, but rather the sort of agonizing sacrifice that honor sometimes demanded when personal happiness conflicted with responsibilities too great to ignore without condemning innocent people to suffering and loss. Yet even as understanding began to dawn, the hurt and anger of those terrible months when she had believed herself forgotten and discarded remained too deep and painful to be easily dismissed or forgiven, leaving her caught between the woman she had become through necessity and the girl who had once loved without reservation or doubt. It was during the third evening of the house party, as guests gathered in the music room for an impromptu concert, that Serafina made her move with the calculating precision that had always characterized her approach to potential threats to her position and security. She had observed the undercurrents of tension and unresolved emotion that swirled around her husband whenever Miss Ashworth appeared, and she had decided that decisive action was required to eliminate this disruption to her carefully ordered existence. Rising from her place beside the pianoforte, where a young lady was rendering a particularly challenging piece by Mozart, Serafina moved with deliberate grace to where Cordelia sat with Lady Thornbury near the back of the room, her smile radiating the sort of false warmth that fooled no one who possessed even minimal powers of observation. "Miss Ashworth," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber, despite the ongoing musical performance, "what a delightful surprise to encounter you again after all this time. I trust you have found your new circumstances agreeable after your family's unfortunate financial reversals made your previous expectations quite impossible to maintain." The calculated cruelty of the comment was designed to humiliate and diminish, to remind everyone present of Cordelia's reduced circumstances, while positioning Serafina herself as the victor in whatever competition she imagined had existed between them. Yet the attack backfired spectacularly when Lady Thornbury rose to her full, admittedly modest height and fixed the Duchess with a stare that could have frozen champagne in July. "My dear Duchess," she replied in a voice that dripped with aristocratic disdain, "I fear your information is somewhat outdated. Miss Ashworth's circumstances are entirely comfortable, and her position in my household reflects her exceptional qualifications rather than any sort of charitable accommodation. Indeed, I consider myself fortunate to have secured the services of someone whose intelligence and discretion are so highly valued throughout London society." The rebuke was delivered with such icy precision that several nearby guests turned to witness the exchange, and Serafina found herself in the uncomfortable position of having revealed her own petty motivations while accomplishing nothing except to demonstrate her lack of breeding and consideration for others. The storm that swept across the countryside on the fourth evening of the house party arrived with the sort of dramatic intensity that poets might have invented to serve as backdrop for momentous encounters and revelations that could not be delayed or avoided any longer. Cordelia had sought refuge in Lord Pembroke's extensive library, hoping to find solitude among the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, in a testament to generations of scholarly interests and literary appreciation. The room was her favorite retreat during these difficult days. offering both intellectual stimulation and emotional sanctuary from the constant tension of navigating social situations where every word carried multiple meanings and every glance held potential for misinterpretation or painful recognition. She was absorbed in a particularly engaging treatise on botanical illustrations, when the first rumbles of thunder announced the approaching tempest, followed shortly by rain that began as gentle pattering against the tall windows and quickly escalated into the sort of downpour that made travel impossible and trapped everyone within whatever shelter they had managed to find. It was then that Alexander appeared in the library doorway. His hair slightly disheveled from his hasty retreat from the gardens where he had been walking in an attempt to escape the suffocating atmosphere of forced sociability that characterized these gatherings, his eyes holding the sort of desperate determination that suggested he had finally reached the limits of his endurance for polite pretense and meaningless conversation. "Cordelia," he said simply, his voice rough with emotions too long suppressed, "we must talk." The inevitability of this moment had been building since her arrival at Thornfield Park, yet now that it had arrived, she found herself torn between the desire to hear his explanations and the fear that understanding might prove more painful than ignorance had been. "Please," she replied quietly, setting aside her book and rising to face him with as much dignity as she could summon. "I think enough has been said between us already, and nothing can be gained by rehashing circumstances that are long past changing. You believe I abandoned you callously, that I broke my promise for reasons of convenience or ambition?" he said, moving closer despite her obvious reluctance to engage in this conversation. "You think that I chose wealth and position over the love we shared? That I discarded you like an inconvenient obligation when better prospects presented themselves? But you are wrong, Cordelia, so utterly wrong that it breaks my heart to know you have carried that burden of betrayal all these years when the truth is far more complex and infinitely more painful." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and despite all her careful defenses, she found herself listening as he continued with words that seemed to pour from his soul like water from a broken dam. "When I promised to wait for you, I meant every word with every fiber of my being. But I did not know then the true extent of my family's debts, or the number of people whose livelihoods depended upon decisions I would be forced to make. 500 tenant farmers and their families, Cordelia, people who had served my family faithfully for generations, faced starvation and homelessness if I could not secure immediate financial relief. To marry you would have meant condemning all of them to suffer for my happiness, while marriage to Serafina provided not only the dowry needed to preserve their homes and employment, but also the political connections necessary to rebuild what my father's poor judgment had nearly destroyed. I had to choose between my heart and my honor, between personal joy and duty to those who trusted me to protect them. And I chose duty, though it nearly destroyed me to do so." His words hit her with the force of physical blows, each revelation adding another layer to her understanding of the impossible situation he had faced. Yet the hurt of those terrible months when she had believed herself abandoned remained too deep to be easily healed by explanations, however sincere they might be. "And what of my letters?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What of the promises you made me to communicate, to explain, to trust me with the truth instead of leaving me to wonder and hope and eventually despair?" "What letters?" he replied with such obvious confusion that her heart began to race with new possibilities and terrible suspicions. "I received nothing from you after I left Hampshire. Nothing that might have made this unbearable choice slightly more bearable by allowing me to explain my circumstances and beg your forgiveness for what I was about to do." The days following the library revelation moved with the inexorable weight of fate itself, each sunrise bringing new opportunities for stolen glances and whispered conversations that both Alexander and Cordelia knew they should avoid, yet found themselves powerless to resist, like moths drawn to a flame that promised beauty even as it threatened destruction. The knowledge of Edmund's treachery and the true circumstances surrounding Alexander's marriage had shifted the very foundation of Cordelia's understanding, transforming her carefully constructed narrative of betrayal into something far more complex and morally ambiguous that left her struggling to reconcile her newfound sympathy with the bitter lessons of independence she had learned during 2 years of deliberate isolation from such dangerous emotions. She found herself watching Alexander with new eyes during the various entertainments that filled their days, seeing not the callous fortune hunter she had imagined him to be, but rather a man carrying the weight of impossible choices and their inevitable consequences, his every gesture shadowed by the sort of profound sadness that came from sacrificing personal happiness for the welfare of others who could never fully understand the price he had paid on their behalf. Yet even as understanding blossomed between them like flowers after a long winter, the reality of his marriage to Seraphina remained an insurmountable barrier that made their growing emotional intimacy both more precious and more dangerous with each passing hour. During morning walks through the estate's magnificent gardens, they would find themselves naturally gravitating toward one another, despite their best intentions to maintain proper distance, their conversations flowing with the sort of easy familiarity that spoke of deep connection and shared understanding, yet always carefully avoiding the subjects that might lead them into territory where honor and desire would come into direct and irreconcilable conflict. Alexander spoke of his work improving conditions for his tenants, his voice warming with genuine satisfaction as he described new schools and modernized cottages that his marriage settlement had made possible, while Cordelia shared her own experiences as a companion, the small triumphs and satisfactions that had helped her build a life of purpose and dignity despite the circumstances that had driven her from her original expectations. There was something both healing and heartbreaking about these exchanges, the gradual rebuilding of trust and affection between two people who had once shared dreams of a very different future, yet who were now separated by circumstances that made any renewal of their former relationship impossible to contemplate without betraying the very principles that had shaped their characters and guided their most difficult decisions. Lady Pembroke, whose keen eyes missed very little of what transpired under her roof, had taken it upon herself to serve as both observer and gentle guide during these treacherous days, recognizing in Cordelia a kindred spirit who valued integrity above convenience, and in Alexander a man whose essential goodness had been tested but not destroyed by the harsh realities of his position. She arranged their encounters with subtle skill, ensuring that they had opportunities for private conversation while also providing the sort of wise counsel that might help them navigate the dangerous waters of renewed affection without compromising their honor or causing scandal that could destroy them both. "My dear child," she said to Cordelia one afternoon as they sat in her private sitting room overlooking the rose garden where Alexander could be seen walking with obvious restlessness, "I have observed the world long enough to know that the heart rarely consults with the mind before making its choices. Yet I have also learned that true happiness cannot be built upon the foundation of others' pain, no matter how justified our own feelings might seem." She spoke with the authority of someone who had herself faced similar trials, whose own marriage had been arranged for practical reasons, yet had eventually blossomed into genuine affection through patience, compromise, and the gradual recognition that duty and love need not be mutually exclusive if both parties possessed sufficient wisdom and goodwill. "The greatest test of our character," Lady Pembroke continued, "comes not when we face obvious choices between right and wrong, but when we must choose between competing claims upon our loyalty, between personal happiness and the welfare of others who trust us to consider their needs alongside our own. Yet even as these wise words resonated in Cordelia's mind, she found herself increasingly drawn into moments of dangerous intimacy with Alexander that tested her resolve and challenged every principle she had used to rebuild her life after their separation. The crisis that had been building beneath the surface of polite social interaction finally erupted on the 7th evening of the house party, when the combination of autumn rain and forced proximity created conditions that neither Alexander nor Cordelia possessed sufficient willpower to resist without outside intervention. They had been in the conservatory, examining Lady Pembroke's prized collection of exotic orchids while discussing the botanical illustrations that had first brought them together in the Ravenshollow Library years earlier, their conversation gradually shifting from scholarly observations to more personal reflections about the dreams and disappointments that had shaped their separate journeys during the years of their separation. The enclosed space filled with tropical warmth and the intoxicating perfume of rare blooms created an atmosphere of intimacy that made the outside world seem very far away, while the gentle patter of rain against the glass walls provided the sort of romantic backdrop that poets might have designed to encourage lovers to forget all considerations beyond their immediate desire to reclaim what they had lost. Alexander stood very close to her as she bent to examine a particularly exquisite specimen, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and catch the familiar scent of his cologne that brought back vivid memories of those stolen moments in summer gardens when their love had seemed capable of conquering any obstacle the world might place in their path. When she straightened and turned to face him, she found herself trapped between his tall frame and the wooden display table, her breath catching as she realized that the careful distance they had maintained was no longer possible to preserve. "Cordelia," he whispered, his voice rough with longing suppressed too long. "I know I have no right to speak of what still burns in my heart, yet I cannot continue this pretense that you mean nothing to me, that seeing you again has not awakened everything I thought I had successfully buried beneath layers of duty and resignation." His hand rose to cup her cheek with the sort of reverent tenderness that spoke of love too deep to be destroyed by time or circumstance, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, she allowed herself to lean into his touch, to close her eyes and remember what it felt like to be cherished completely and without reservation. The kiss that followed was inevitable as sunrise, yet it carried within it all the desperate passion of two souls who had been separated by forces beyond their control and who now found themselves offered one precious moment of reunion before honor demanded that they step back from the precipice that yawned before them. Yet even as her body responded to his embrace with an intensity that frightened her, Cordelia's mind remained clear enough to recognize the destruction that would follow if they allowed passion to overcome the principles that had sustained them both through years of loneliness and sacrifice. "Alexander," she whispered against his lips, stepping back with every ounce of strength she possessed, "we cannot do this. Not while you are married, not while such actions would make us the sort of people who place their own desires above all other considerations. I will not be the woman who destroys a marriage, regardless of whether that marriage was chosen for love or duty. And I will not ask you to become a man who breaks sacred vows for the sake of reclaiming what we have lost." Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, yet they also revealed the depth of her own internal struggle, the battle between desire and integrity that left her trembling with the effort of choosing the harder path, when the easier one promised such immediate relief from years of emotional starvation. Alexander stepped back as though she had struck him, his face a mask of pain and admiration as he recognized both the wisdom of her words and the strength of character that enabled her to speak them even when doing so clearly cost her everything she had ever wanted. "You are right, of course," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation and something that, might have been relief. "You are everything I remembered and more. Everything I have missed during these terrible years. Yet you are also far too good to compromise your principles for my sake, just as I must be strong enough to honor my commitments even when they feel like chains that bind me to a life I never wanted." They stood facing each other in the perfumed air of the conservatory, two people who loved each other with a depth and constancy that few couples ever experienced, yet who were mature enough to recognize that love alone was not sufficient justification for actions that would destroy innocent people and betray the very values that had made them worthy of such devotion in the first place. It was then that Serafina chose to make her entrance, her timing so perfectly calculated that it seemed almost supernatural in its precision, her beautiful face composed in lines of wounded dignity that would have been convincing to anyone who had not observed her carefully orchestrated manipulations during the preceding days. She stood in the doorway of the conservatory like an avenging angel, her silk evening gown rustling with each breath as she surveyed the scene before her with eyes that missed no detail of their obvious emotional turmoil and reluctant separation. "How touching," she said in a voice that carried just the right note of pained surprise to suggest innocence betrayed rather than suspicion confirmed. "To discover my husband renewing his acquaintance with old friends in such an intimate setting while I search for him throughout the house like a wife concerned for his whereabouts." The accusation was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, while clear enough to plant seeds of scandal in the minds of anyone who might overhear, yet Cordelia faced it with the sort of quiet dignity that had become her trademark during years of navigating situations where her reputation depended upon her ability to rise above the petty machinations of those who sought to diminish her. "Your Grace," she replied with a slight curtsy that acknowledged rank while refusing to show any sign of guilt or embarrassment. His Grace was kind enough to share his knowledge of botanical illustration techniques, a subject in which I have maintained scholarly interest since my youth. I trust you will forgive us for becoming so absorbed in academic discussion that we failed to notice the lateness of the hour." The response was perfectly crafted to deflect suspicion while providing a plausible explanation for their private meeting. Yet Serafina was far from finished with her campaign to eliminate what she perceived as a threat to her position and security. Indeed, she continued with a smile that never reached her eyes, how fortunate for His Grace to encounter someone who shares his intellectual pursuits, though I confess I had not realized that botanical studies required such close physical proximity or generated such obvious emotional intensity. I do hope that Lady Pembroke's other guests have not been subjected to similar displays of scholarly enthusiasm. The insult was delivered with such elegant venom that it took several seconds for its full impact to register, yet when it did, Cordelia felt the familiar surge of strength that had sustained her through every crisis she had faced since losing her parents and her original place in society. "I fear your Grace may be allowing anxiety about your husband's welfare to color your interpretation of an innocent encounter," she replied, with the sort of calm authority that came from absolute confidence in her own integrity, though I certainly understand how a wife might feel concerned when unable to locate her spouse during a social gathering. Perhaps in future it would be wise to establish some system of communication that would prevent such misunderstandings from arising. The suggestion was delivered with such apparent helpfulness that Serafina found herself momentarily speechless, having expected either defensive denials or guilty acknowledgments, rather than the sort of mature response that made her own behavior seem petty and suspicious by comparison. Yet she was far from defeated, and the events of the following evening would prove that desperation could drive even the most calculating person to acts of recklessness that revealed the true depths of their character while setting in motion consequences that no one could have anticipated or controlled. The discovery that would change everything came not through deliberate investigation, but through the sort of accident that fate seemed to engineer when circumstances reached their inevitable breaking point. A moment of pure chance that revealed truths carefully hidden beneath layers of deception and manipulation, designed to protect secrets that could destroy lives and reputations with their revelation. Cordelia had been returning a borrowed book to the library when she noticed that Serafina had left her reticule behind on one of the reading tables, its contents partially spilled in a way that suggested hasty departure, or perhaps the sort of nervous agitation that had characterized the Duchess's behavior throughout the house party. Her first instinct was to gather the scattered items and deliver them discreetly to their owner. Yet, as she began collecting the various feminine articles that had fallen from the elegant beaded bag, her attention was caught by several folded documents bearing official seals and the sort of formal script that suggested legal or financial importance. She had not intended to examine them closely, yet the heading of one particular paper made her pause in recognition, for it bore the name of the Ravens Hollow estate agent, whose signature she remembered from documents her father had shown her years earlier when explaining the complexities of large property management. What she read in those stolen moments of horrified fascination was evidence of systematic theft on a scale that staggered her understanding. Carefully forged authorizations for the sale of valuable estate assets, receipts for transactions that diverted funds meant for tenant improvements into private accounts, and detailed records of a deception so elaborate that it must have required months of careful planning and execution. The amounts involved were staggering, representing not merely personal enrichment, but the wholesale looting of resources that Alexander believed were being used to fulfill his promises to the families who depended upon his estate for their livelihoods. Each document told part of a larger story of betrayal that went far beyond mere marital unhappiness, revealing Serafina as someone capable of destroying the very foundations of trust and security that made civilized society possible. As Cordelia read through the damning evidence, her mind reeled with the implications not only for Alexander, but for the hundreds of tenant families whose welfare had been sacrificed to fund what appeared to be gambling debts of truly astronomical proportions. The records showed payments to notorious gaming houses and moneylenders, whose reputations were known even to someone of her limited experience with the seamier aspects of London society, suggesting that Serafina's elegant composure masked an addiction that had driven her to increasingly desperate measures to maintain her lifestyle while concealing the true extent of her financial recklessness. Yet even as anger rose in Cordelia's throat at the magnitude of this betrayal, she found herself faced with a moral dilemma that had no easy resolution, for exposing these crimes would certainly destroy Serafina, but might also create a scandal that could ruin Alexander's reputation and destroy his ability to fulfill his obligations to those who depended upon him. She stood frozen in the library, the incriminating documents trembling in her hands as she wrestled with questions that seemed to have no right answers, wondering whether justice demanded exposure regardless of consequences, or whether protecting Alexander's position might serve the greater good, even if it meant allowing Serafina's crimes to continue unpunished. The sound of approaching footsteps forced her to make an immediate decision, and she quickly gathered the papers and tucked them inside her own reticule just as Serafina herself appeared in the doorway. Her beautiful face composed, but her eyes holding the sort of desperate wariness that suggested she suspected exactly what had been discovered in her moment of carelessness. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Cordelia had ever experienced. A verbal duel conducted with the sort of deadly politeness that characterized conflicts between people of breeding who understood that true warfare could be waged with words and implications rather than crude accusations or emotional displays. "I believe you may have something that belongs to me," Serafina said, her voice carrying just enough steel to suggest that pretense was no longer possible while maintaining the fiction that this remained a civilized conversation between ladies. "Indeed," Cordelia replied, her own tone carefully neutral as she faced the woman whose crimes she now understood in their full, horrifying scope. "I was attempting to return your reticule when some of its contents spilled, and I fear I may have inadvertently gathered more than I intended in my haste to restore your property to good order." The dance of words continued for several minutes, each woman testing the other's knowledge and resolve, while avoiding direct statements that might force immediate crisis or irrevocable commitment to positions from which retreat would be impossible. Yet gradually it became clear that pretense was futile, that Cordelia's expression revealed too much understanding for Serafina to maintain her innocence, just as Serafina's increasing desperation made it obvious that the accusations implicit in their exchange were entirely accurate. "Very well," Serafina said at last, abandoning all pretense of dignity as she sank into a nearby chair with the sort of defeated posture that revealed the exhaustion of maintaining deceptions that had grown too complex to sustain any longer. "You have discovered my secret, and now you hold my fate in your hands, though I wonder if you truly understand the full complexity of the situation you have stumbled into so accidentally." She spoke then with the sort of bitter honesty that sometimes emerged when people found themselves with nothing left to lose, revealing the depth of her gambling addiction and the desperation that had driven her to increasingly bold thefts from the very estate that her marriage was supposed to protect and restore. "I never loved your precious Alexander," she continued, with a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "Nor did he love me, though he was gentleman enough to treat me with courtesy and respect, even when our marriage bed became a source of mutual disappointment and regret. We married for practical reasons, he to save his tenants, and I to escape creditors who had grown impatient with my father's promises to cover my gaming debts. Yet even his generous marriage settlement proved insufficient to satisfy obligations that continued to grow with each desperate attempt to win back what I had already lost." The confession poured from her like poison from a wound, each revelation adding new layers to Cordelia's understanding of the web of deception and desperation that had trapped them all in circumstances none of them had chosen yet, from which escape seemed almost impossible to achieve. "I can offer you something," Serafina said suddenly, her voice taking on the calculating tone of someone accustomed to bargaining for advantage even in the most desperate circumstances. "Alexander believes himself bound by honor to remain married to me. Yet I care nothing for the sanctity of vows that were never more than business arrangements designed to serve purposes they have utterly failed to achieve. Give me those documents and enough money to disappear permanently from England, and I will provide you with evidence that our marriage was invalid from the beginning, that certain legal requirements were deliberately overlooked in our haste to complete the ceremony before creditors could interfere with the settlement arrangements." The proposition was delivered with the sort of matter-of-fact directness that suggested Serafina viewed marriage, theft, and abandonment as merely different strategies in a larger game where personal survival trumped all other considerations. "You would be free to pursue your happiness with Alexander, while I would be free to seek my fortune in places where English law cannot reach me, and past mistakes might be forgotten in favor of new opportunities for both success and failure." Yet even as the offer hung between them like forbidden fruit, Cordelia found herself facing the most fundamental test of character she had ever encountered, forced to choose between personal happiness purchased through complicity with crime and the sort of principled action that might destroy her own chances for joy while protecting innocent people from continued victimization. The decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the futures of everyone touched by this web of deception and betrayal came to Cordelia with the sort of clarity that sometimes emerged from moral crisis, cutting through complexity and self-interest to reveal the single path that honor demanded regardless of personal cost or consequence. She looked at Seraphina with something approaching pity, seeing not the elegant duchess whose beauty and position had once seemed so enviable, but rather a woman whose choices had gradually stripped away everything valuable about her character until only calculating desperation remained. "I cannot accept your offer," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was rejecting, "not because I do not long for the happiness you promise, but because purchasing that happiness through silence about crimes that harm innocent people would make me complicit in evil that I cannot rationalize or excuse regardless of personal benefit." The refusal hit Seraphina like a physical blow, her face registering first disbelief, then rage, as she realized that her carefully constructed escape plan was crumbling before her eyes. "You little fool," she hissed, abandoning all pretense of aristocratic composure as desperation overcame breeding and calculation gave way to raw fury. "Do you not understand that exposing me will destroy Alexander as surely as it destroys me? That the scandal will make it impossible for him to maintain the social connections necessary to protect his tenants and preserve his estate on? You speak of protecting innocent people while choosing actions that will harm the very people you claim to care about most." Yet Cordelia had already considered these arguments and found them insufficient to override the fundamental principle that evil must be opposed regardless of the complications that opposition might create. "I believe that Alexander is strong enough to survive scandal and find new ways to fulfill his obligations," she replied, with the sort of quiet conviction that comes from absolute certainty about moral choices. "But I know that allowing theft and deception to continue unchallenged will eventually destroy everything good that his marriage was meant to preserve. Better to face crisis honestly than to build security upon foundations of lies that must eventually collapse under their own weight." The confrontation ended with Seraphina's bitter promise of retaliation and Cordelia's calm acceptance of whatever consequences might follow from doing what she believed to be right, setting in motion events that would test every relationship and assumption that had shaped their lives while forcing all of them to discover what they truly valued when forced to choose between competing loyalties and conflicting demands upon their conscience and courage. The revelation of Seraphina's crimes came not as the dramatic public exposure that literature might have demanded, but through the sort of careful, methodical process that Alexander's sense of justice and responsibility required, despite the personal pain that each new discovery inflicted upon his already battered faith in human nature and his own judgment. Cordelia had chosen to present her evidence privately, giving him the opportunity to investigate thoroughly before deciding how to proceed. Yet she had made it clear that her silence was temporary and conditional upon his willingness to take action that would protect future victims, even if it meant sacrificing his own comfort and security. The documents she provided told a story of betrayal so comprehensive that it took several days of careful examination to understand its full scope. Yet Alexander approached the investigation with the sort of methodical thoroughness that had made him an effective estate manager despite his youth and relative inexperience, when he inherited responsibilities that would have challenged men twice his age. Each forged signature and falsified record revealed new depths of deception that made him question everything he thought he understood about his marriage and his wife's character. Yet he also found himself overwhelmed by admiration for Cordelia's integrity in exposing crimes that could have been used for personal advantage, yet were instead revealed in service of justice and protection for those too powerless to protect themselves. When he finally confronted Seraphina with the evidence of her systematic theft, her response revealed the full extent of her transformation from the charming young woman he had married into someone whose desperation had gradually eroded every principle and consideration except immediate self-preservation. She neither denied nor defended her actions, but instead launched into a litany of justifications and accusations that blamed everyone except herself for circumstances that had driven her to increasingly desperate measures, revealing a complete absence of remorse or understanding about the harm her choices had caused to people who had trusted her to honor the obligations that came with privilege and position. The legal proceedings that followed were as complex as they were painful, requiring delicate negotiations with magistrates and barristers who understood the social implications of prosecuting a duchess, while also recognizing that justice demanded some accounting for crimes that had victimized people with no power to seek redress through normal channels. Alexander's decision to pursue both criminal charges and annulment proceedings was guided by his determination to ensure that Serafina faced consequences for her actions, while also freeing himself to rebuild his estates on foundations of honesty rather than the deception that had characterized his marriage from its inception. Yet even as legal resolution approached, he found himself facing new challenges that tested his commitment to rebuilding his life according to principles he could respect rather than merely expedience and social convention. Challenges that would determine whether the lessons learned through pain and betrayal could become the foundation for something better than what had been lost through others' manipulation and his own naive faith in the goodness of people whose true characters had been hidden beneath carefully maintained facades of respectability and charm. The months that followed the legal proceedings moved with the measured pace of seasons changing, each day bringing small increments of progress toward resolution, yet also revealing the true cost of scandal and legal battles that consumed both financial resources and social standing with equal ruthlessness. Alexander had withdrawn to Ravenshollow's most remote estate, a modest manor house in Northumberland that offered both practical refuge from London gossip and symbolic return to the simple country life that had shaped his earliest understanding of duty and responsibility before marriage and social obligation had complicated his world with layers of deception and compromise. The work of rebuilding began not with grand gestures or dramatic reforms, but with the patient daily labor of a man determined to restore not only his property but his character, spending long hours in tenant cottages listening to stories of hardship and need that his wife's theft had created, while carefully documenting every missing resource and stolen opportunity that would need to be replaced through honest effort rather than convenient marriage settlements. His hands, once soft with aristocratic privilege, grew calloused from physical labor as he worked alongside his tenants to repair buildings and clear fields, finding in manual work a kind of redemption that no amount of social restoration could have provided. The transformation was both physical and spiritual, stripping away the artificial refinements of London society to reveal the fundamental character that had been buried beneath years of obligation and compromise. Yet it was also profoundly lonely work that left him aching not only for Cordelia's presence, but for the chance to share with her the insights and discoveries that emerged from this process of deliberate rebuilding. Each evening found him writing letters that he rarely sent, pouring onto paper the thoughts and feelings that had no other outlet, describing the small victories and setbacks that marked his progress toward becoming the man he had always intended to be, before circumstances forced him into choices that betrayed his deepest values. Meanwhile, Cordelia had accepted a position with a family in the Scottish Highlands, removing herself so completely from the world they had shared that even the most determined gossips eventually found other scandals to occupy their attention and malicious speculation. The MacLeod family proved both demanding and rewarding employers, their 3 young daughters requiring not only traditional academic instruction, but the sort of patient guidance that helped them navigate the complex transition from childhood to young womanhood, in a world that offered limited opportunities for female independence and self-determination. She found unexpected satisfaction in this work, discovering talents for teaching and mentoring that had been dormant during her years as a mere companion, yet she also struggled with the isolation that came from hiding her true education and background behind the modest persona expected of a governess, in a household that valued discretion above brilliance. The Highland landscape provided both beauty and metaphor for her own internal journey, its wild grandeur serving as daily reminder that strength could emerge from the most challenging circumstances if one possessed sufficient courage to embrace change rather than merely endure it. Her letters to Lady Thornbury, who maintained their correspondence despite the potential social cost, became lifelines to a world beyond the narrow confines of her current existence. Yet she carefully avoided any mention of Alexander or the events that had driven her to this exile, focusing instead on small observations about her students' progress and the unexpected joys of helping young minds discover their own potential for growth and achievement. It was during the long winter evenings, when snow fell steadily outside her small sitting-room window and the MacLeod daughters were safely tucked into their beds after yet another day of lessons and supervised recreation, that Cordelia found herself confronting the fundamental questions about her future that she had been avoiding since fleeing London and its painful associations. Lady Thornbury's letters brought occasional news of Alexander's progress in restoring his estate and reputation. Carefully neutral reports that revealed nothing of his personal feelings, yet suggested that he was finding both purpose and satisfaction in the honest labor of rebuilding what others had destroyed through their greed and deception. These glimpses into his new life stirred emotions that she had thought safely buried beneath layers of practical necessity and determined independence, yet she refused to allow herself the luxury of hoping for any outcome beyond the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he was healing from the betrayals that had shaped their separation. When spring arrived in the Highlands, with its promise of renewal and fresh beginnings, she received an unexpected letter from her former employer's solicitor informing her that Lady Worthington had died peacefully in her sleep and had chosen to remember Cordelia's faithful service with a bequest that, while modest by aristocratic standards, represented more money than she had ever imagined possessing in her own right. The inheritance was accompanied by a personal note from Lady Worthington herself, written during her final illness, expressing gratitude for Cordelia's companionship and wisdom during the difficult years following her husband's death, and urging her to use the money in whatever way would bring her the greatest happiness and fulfillment. The letter concluded with observations about the nature of love and duty that revealed Lady Worthington's awareness of the sacrifices Cordelia had made and her hope that better times lay ahead for someone whose character had been tested by adversity, yet remained uncompromised by the temptations that destroyed lesser people. As Cordelia sat in her modest room reading these words of encouragement and remembrance, she found herself facing a choice that would determine not only her own future, but potentially Alexander's as well. For Lady Thornbury's most recent letter had mentioned in passing that the legal costs of the annulment proceedings and the need to repay Seraphina's stolen funds had left him facing the very financial crisis that his marriage had been intended to prevent. The irony was not lost on her that she now possessed the means to help him save his estate and fulfill his obligations to his tenants, yet doing so would require the sort of anonymous generosity that expected no recognition or gratitude in return, a gesture that would prove her love through sacrifice rather than through any hope of personal gain or eventual reunion. The decision to help Alexander came not through dramatic internal struggle, but through the simple recognition that true love sometimes required the courage to act without hope of reward, to choose another's welfare over one's own desires, even when such choices guaranteed continued loneliness and separation. Cordelia arranged the transfer of funds through a series of intermediaries and false names that would make tracing the source almost impossible, ensuring that Alexander would be able to pay his legal debts and restore the stolen resources without ever knowing that his salvation had come from the woman whose presence in his life had caused so much upheaval and pain. She told herself that this anonymity was necessary to preserve his pride and prevent any sense of obligation that might compromise his ability to make free choices about his future. Yet she also recognized that her own motives were more complex, encompassing both genuine altruism and the self-protective instinct that made her reluctant to risk another rejection or disappointment if her gesture were misunderstood or unwelcome. The mechanics of the transaction required several weeks to complete, during which she maintained her normal routine of lessons and household duties while carrying within her heart the knowledge that she was about to change Alexander's life in ways he would never fully understand, giving him the freedom to rebuild his world according to his own values rather than the compromises that financial desperation might force upon him. When the final papers were signed and the money transferred, she felt both profound satisfaction and devastating loss, knowing that she had done everything within her power to ensure his happiness, while simultaneously accepting that her own future lay along a different path that might never again intersect with his. Yet even as she resigned herself to permanent separation, fate was already setting in motion the series of discoveries and revelations that would challenge her assumptions about the finality of their parting, and Alexander's understanding of her true character and the depth of her continuing devotion to his welfare above her own happiness. The discovery of Cordelia's anonymous generosity came about through the sort of accident that seemed too convenient for fiction, yet occurred with startling frequency in real life when careful plans were undone by overlooked details and hidden connections that revealed themselves only after it was too late to maintain the secrecy that had been so carefully constructed. Alexander's London banker, a discreet gentleman who had served the Ravenshollow family for 3 generations, let slip during a routine meeting a comment about the unusual nature of the recent transaction that had saved the estate from bankruptcy, mentioning in passing that the funds had come through intermediaries connected to a Scottish law firm that specialized in managing the affairs of governess and companions, seeking to provide anonymous assistance to worthy causes. The comment was meant merely as an observation about the mysterious ways in which Providence sometimes intervened in human affairs, yet it provided Alexander with the crucial clue that led him through a careful investigation of the transfer's origins, each step revealing new evidence that pointed toward a conclusion almost too wonderful to believe, yet too detailed to deny. When he finally confronted the Scottish solicitor who had managed the transaction, the man's professional discretion crumbled before Alexander's obvious distress, and his passionate arguments about the importance of knowing his benefactor's identity, revealing at last that the money had come from a governess in the Highlands, whose previous employer had left her a modest inheritance which she had chosen to use in this extraordinary gesture of anonymous charity. The revelation struck Alexander with the force of a physical blow, overwhelming him with simultaneous gratitude, admiration, and shame as he realized that Cordelia had sacrificed her own financial security to save his estate and reputation while expecting nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing she had helped him fulfill his obligations to the people who depended upon him. The magnitude of her generosity and the selflessness of her motives forced him to confront the depth of his own feelings and the hollow meaninglessness of the careful rebuilding he had undertaken while believing himself permanently separated from the only person whose opinion and welfare truly mattered to him. Within hours of learning the truth, he was preparing for the journey to Scotland, abandoning the cautious approaches and gradual progress that had characterized his recent efforts in favor of the sort of immediate, decisive action that love demanded when faced with such overwhelming evidence of devotion and sacrifice. The letters he had written but never sent were hastily gathered and packed along with carefully chosen tokens of his own journey toward redemption. Yet he travelled north with the terrifying knowledge that Cordelia's gesture might represent not an invitation for reunion, but rather a final gift intended to free her from any sense of obligation or connection to his future happiness and success. The journey to Scotland had provided Alexander with ample time to rehearse the words he hoped to speak when he finally found Cordelia. Yet when he stood at last before the modest stone cottage that served as the MacLeod family's governess quarters, watching her emerge from the kitchen garden with an armful of late autumn vegetables, he discovered that all his careful preparation was utterly inadequate for the reality of seeing her again after months of separation and uncertainty. She looked up from her task of gathering root vegetables for the evening meal and froze at the sight of him standing by the garden gate, her face cycling through expressions of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope, before settling into the composed mask she had perfected during their years of enforced separation. Alexander himself felt the familiar rush of emotion that her presence always provoked, yet it was tempered now by the deeper understanding that had emerged from months of honest self-examination and the humbling recognition of how completely he had misunderstood both her character and the true nature of love itself. "Miss Ashworth," he said formally, removing his hat and offering the sort of respectful bow that acknowledged both her position and his awareness that he had forfeited any claim to familiarity through the circumstances that had divided them. "I hope you will forgive this unexpected intrusion, but I have travelled from Northumberland because I recently learned of a kindness shown to my family that demands both acknowledgement and, if you will permit it, a conversation that has been far too long delayed." Her response was equally careful, years of experience having taught her to guard against the sort of emotional vulnerability that had once led to such devastating disappointment. "Your Grace," she replied with a slight curtsy that maintained proper distance while revealing nothing of her inner turmoil, "you are welcome at MacLeod House as any gentleman traveller would be, though I confess myself puzzled by any supposed connection between your family's affairs and my own humble circumstances." The dance of formal politeness continued for several minutes, each testing the other's intentions while avoiding direct acknowledgement of the emotional undercurrents that made every word fraught with multiple meanings and dangerous possibilities. Yet gradually, as they walked together along the path that led toward the loch, where autumn mist rose like spirits from the dark water, their conversation began to shed the protective layers of convention that had initially governed their exchange. "I know what you did," Alexander said at last, his voice rough with emotions too complex for easy expression. "I know that you received an inheritance from Lady Worthington and chose to use it to save my estate from bankruptcy, expecting nothing in return except the knowledge that you had prevented my tenants from suffering for my poor judgment and others' greed. The revelation hung between them like a bridge that could either connect or divide, depending upon how she chose to respond to this exposure of her most private act of generosity. I know also that this gesture represents far more than mere charity, that it required you to sacrifice your own security and independence for the welfare of people you have never met simply because their happiness mattered to someone who once mattered to you." Cordelia stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her composure finally cracking enough to reveal the depth of feeling she had been struggling to conceal since his unexpected appearance. "You should not have investigated the source of that assistance," she said quietly, her voice carrying both reproach and something that sounded almost like fear. "It was given freely, without conditions or expectations, and discovering its origin serves no purpose except to create obligations where none were intended or desired." But that was exactly why he had needed to find her, why the anonymous nature of her gift had made it impossible for him to accept it without seeking her out to offer something in return. "That is precisely why I had to come," he replied with the sort of earnest intensity that had always characterized his most important moments. Because you expected nothing, because you asked for nothing, because you gave everything you had to someone who had already caused you such pain. You proved a depth of character that humbles me and forces me to acknowledge how completely I failed to understand what love truly means. He moved closer, yet maintained the respectful distance that acknowledged her right to refuse whatever he might ask of her. I have spent these months learning to rebuild my life according to principles I can respect rather than social convenience, yet I now realize that all my efforts at redemption are meaningless if I cannot find the courage to ask for what I want most in this world. Cordelia, I have come to request permission to court you properly, not as the desperate young man who once made promises he could not keep, but as someone who has learned the true cost of his choices and is prepared to prove himself worthy of your consideration through patient demonstration rather than passionate declarations. The proposal was delivered with such careful humility that it took her several moments to fully comprehend what he was offering, not the grand romantic gesture that literature might have demanded, but rather the sort of mature recognition that real love required time, trust, and mutual respect to develop into something strong enough to withstand the pressures that had destroyed their earlier hopes. Yet even as her heart leaped at the possibility he presented, her mind remained cautious, protective of the hard-won independence that had sustained her through years of disappointment and uncertainty. "If you truly mean what you say," she replied slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone who had learned that promises could be broken and good intentions could crumble under pressure, "then you must understand that I am no longer the naive girl who believed that love alone was sufficient to overcome any obstacle. I have learned to value my independence and self-respect above romantic sentiment, and I will not sacrifice either for the mere hope of happiness that may prove as illusory as our earlier dreams. Any courtship between us must be built upon complete honesty about our circumstances, our expectations, and our ability to maintain mutual respect even when faced with the sort of external pressures that destroyed our previous understanding." Alexander's response revealed both his growth during their separation and his genuine understanding of what she was asking of him. "I would not want you to sacrifice anything that has helped you become the remarkable woman you are now," he said with quiet conviction. "Indeed, it is your strength and independence that make you worthy of a love based on equality, rather than the sort of romantic dependency that characterizes so many marriages of our class. I ask only for the opportunity to prove that I have learned to value partnership over possession, mutual growth over comfortable stagnation, and the sort of honest communication that prevents misunderstandings from destroying what we hope to build together." The months that followed Alexander's arrival in Scotland unfolded with the deliberate pace of people who had learned that genuine intimacy required time to develop and could not be rushed by passion or urgency. Regardless of how keenly they felt the pull of renewed affection and the desire to reclaim what they had lost through others' interference and their own youthful mistakes, Alexander secured lodging at the nearby inn and established a routine of daily visits that allowed them to rebuild their friendship while exploring how the years of separation had changed them both. Conversations that revealed not only their individual growth, but also the ways in which their fundamental compatibility had been strengthened rather than weakened by the trials they had endured apart. They walked together through the Highland landscape as autumn gave way to winter, sharing observations about the natural world that served as metaphors for their own internal seasons of loss and renewal, while carefully avoiding the sort of physical intimacy that might compromise the measured rebuilding of trust they had agreed was necessary before any deeper commitment could be considered. Cordelia's position with the MacLeod family provided both structure and protection for their courtship, ensuring that their renewed acquaintance proceeded under proper supervision while allowing them the privacy necessary for the sort of honest conversation that revealed character and compatibility more clearly than any amount of formal social interaction. The MacLeods themselves proved both curious and supportive, their Highland practicality cutting through English conventions to focus on Alexander's obvious sincerity and Cordelia's visible happiness during his visits. Yet they also served as subtle protectors who ensured that local gossip remained minimal and that their governess's reputation suffered no damage from this unusual romantic development. During long evening conversations by the fire in the family's comfortable sitting room, Alexander shared the lessons he had learned during his months of rebuilding, describing not only the physical restoration of his estate, but also the spiritual journey that had taught him to find satisfaction in honest work and genuine service rather than the artificial satisfactions of social position and inherited privilege. Cordelia, in turn, revealed her own discoveries about the rewards of meaningful work and financial independence. The confidence that came from knowing she could support herself through her own efforts rather than depending upon the generosity or reliability of others for her security and self-respect. These exchanges gradually built a foundation of mutual understanding and respect that was far stronger than the passionate infatuation of their youth. Yet it was also tested by external pressures that reminded them both why their earlier romance had proven so vulnerable to outside interference. Letters from England brought news that society remained divided about Alexander's divorce from Seraphina, some viewing him as a victim of his wife's crimes, while others whispered that his involvement with Cordelia had somehow precipitated the scandal that destroyed his marriage. Edmund's final attempt at interference came in the form of a letter to the MacLeod family, suggesting that their governess was a woman of questionable morals whose presence might corrupt their daughters, a clumsy attack that backfired when Mr. MacLeod responded with the sort of Highland directness that left no doubt about his opinion of anonymous accusations and his confidence in Cordelia's character. The true test of their renewed relationship came not from external opposition, but from the gradual recognition that choosing each other would require ongoing sacrifices and compromises that could not be resolved through romantic gestures or passionate declarations, but would demand daily commitment to values that sometimes conflicted with social expectations or personal convenience. Alexander's financial situation, while improved by Cordelia's anonymous gift, remained precarious enough to require careful management and modest living that would offer few of the luxuries associated with ducal rank, a reality that forced them both to consider whether their love was strong enough to flourish under conditions of genteel economy rather than aristocratic abundance. Cordelia's own position required her to consider whether she was prepared to give up the independence and professional satisfaction she had discovered as a governess in exchange for the uncertainties of marriage to a man whose reputation remained clouded by scandal and whose estate would require years of careful management to achieve true stability. Yet as winter deepened into the sort of Highland cold that tested character as surely as it tested physical endurance, they found that their conversations increasingly turned to shared dreams and practical plans that assumed a future together, discussions of educational philosophies that might guide the raising of children, agricultural innovations that could benefit tenant farmers, and social reforms that might gradually change the conditions that had made their own trials possible. These were not the romantic fantasies of youth, but the mature considerations of adults who understood that lasting happiness required compatibility of values and goals rather than mere emotional attraction. Yet they also revealed a deepening intimacy that made their eventual decision seem both inevitable and carefully reasoned. When Alexander finally asked her formally to marry him, it was not with the desperate urgency of their youth, but with the calm certainty of someone who had tested his feelings through months of daily interaction and found them strengthened rather than diminished by close examination. Her acceptance came with equal deliberation, the response of a woman who had learned to trust her judgment about character and compatibility rather than being swept away by romantic sentiment. Yet it was also accompanied by the sort of quiet joy that acknowledged how rare and precious it was to find someone whose love had survived the trials that destroyed lesser attachments. They married in the small Highland church where Cordelia had found spiritual solace during her months of exile, surrounded by the MacLeod family and a few carefully chosen friends who valued their character above society's opinion. Beginning their new life together with the sort of humble ceremony that emphasized commitment over display and substance over appearance, prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them with the strength that came from knowing they had chosen each other not from desperation or convenience, but from the deepest mutual respect and affection that could sustain a lifetime of shared joys and sorrows. The morning of their wedding dawned with the sort of crystalline Highland clarity that seemed to bless their union with nature's own approval, pale sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows to illuminate the simple preparations that reflected their transformed understanding of what truly mattered in marking life's most significant moments. Cordelia stood before the small mirror in her modest chamber at MacLeod House, arranging the final details of her appearance with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the profound recognition that this day represented not just the fulfillment of long-deferred hopes, but the beginning of a partnership built upon foundations far stronger than those that had supported their youthful dreams. The dress she wore was her own creation, fashioned during the long winter evenings from fabric she had purchased with her governess wages, every stitch representing hours of careful work that had given her time to contemplate the gravity of the commitment she was making, and the joy of finally being able to make it freely, without the shadows of deception or external pressure that had haunted their earlier attempts at happiness. The gown's simplicity was itself a statement of values, its clean lines and modest decoration speaking to a beauty that came from within rather than from costly ornament, while its deep blue color echoed the sapphires in the ring that Alexander had retrieved from his family's jeweler and carried with him to Scotland as a symbol of promises kept despite years of separation and trial. Mrs. MacLeod bustled about the room with the sort of Highland efficiency that masked deep emotional investment, adjusting lace and smoothing fabric while offering advice about marriage that drew upon decades of her own experience, building a life partnership that had weathered the storms that tested Highland families with particular severity. "Aye, lass," she said with the gentle wisdom that had made her both employer and friend during Cordelia's months of service, "a marriage is like a Highland winter, beautiful but demanding, requiring both partners to tend the fire that keeps them warm through the hardest seasons, and never taking for granted that love alone will be sufficient when the winds of change threaten to extinguish what they have built together." These words carried special meaning for Cordelia, who had learned through painful experience that love required not only emotional commitment, but practical wisdom, daily choice, and the sort of mature understanding that could distinguish between romantic fantasy and the deeper satisfactions of genuine partnership built upon mutual respect and shared purpose. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in the inn's modest parlour, receiving similar counsel from Mr. MacLeod, whose Highland directness had cut through English conventions to focus on the essential truths that governed successful marriages, regardless of social rank or financial circumstances. The older man had taken Alexander's measure during the months of careful courtship, and found him worthy not through aristocratic privilege, but through demonstrated character, the sort of patient consistency that proved itself through daily action rather than grand gesture. "You have shown yourself to be a man of honor during these months of waiting," MacLeod said with the gravity that Highland tradition brought to such moments, "treating our lass with the respect she deserves, and proving that you understand the difference between wanting and loving, between desire and commitment. But marriage will test you in ways that courtship cannot. requiring you to choose your wife's welfare over your own convenience, not just in moments of crisis, but in the 1,000 small decisions that shape daily life together. Alexander listened with the sort of focused attention that had become his habit during the months of rebuilding, recognizing in these words the wisdom that came from a lifetime of choosing partnership over individual desire, commitment over convenience, and the long view over immediate satisfaction. The sapphire ring rested in his pocket like a tangible reminder of promises broken and restored, its familiar weight carrying the accumulated significance of generations of Ravenshollow marriages, while also representing his determination to create something new and better from the fragments of what had been lost. When the time came to leave for the church, he felt not the nervous excitement of youth, but the settled confidence of maturity, the calm certainty that came from knowing he was making a choice that had been tested by time, trial, and careful consideration rather than swept along by passion or circumstance beyond his control. The small party that gathered in the ancient stone church represented not the fashionable crowd that might have attended a London wedding, but rather the sort of witnesses whose presence mattered because they valued character over convention, substance over spectacle. Lady Thornbury had made the journey from England despite her advancing years, her presence serving as both blessing and bridge between Cordelia's past and future, while several of Alexander's tenants had travelled from Northumberland to show their respect for the man who had worked alongside them to rebuild what others had destroyed. The MacLeod family filled an entire pew, their Highland pride evident in their careful dress and solemn attention to the ceremony that would claim their beloved governess, while also celebrating the love that had brought such obvious happiness to someone they had come to regard as family rather than mere employee. The ceremony itself proceeded with the sort of quiet dignity that reflected their shared understanding that true significance lay not in elaborate display, but in the sincere exchange of promises that would govern their future together, each word carefully chosen and deeply meant, rather than merely recited from traditional forms that might lack personal meaning. When Alexander placed his mother's sapphire ring upon Cordelia's finger, the gesture carried the weight of family history, while also marking the beginning of something entirely new, a marriage that would honor the past while refusing to be constrained by its limitations or failures. "I give you this ring," he said with voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him, not as a symbol of possession, but as a token of partnership, a reminder that we choose each other not from necessity but from love, not from desperation but from hope, not from weakness, but from the strength we have found in learning to stand apart before choosing to stand together. Cordelia's response carried equal weight and careful thought, her words reflecting the journey that had brought them to this moment of renewed commitment. "I accept this ring and offer my own promise in return," she replied, with the sort of quiet conviction that had sustained her through years of trial and uncertainty, to face whatever challenges await us as equal partners, sharing both burdens and blessings, supporting each other's growth while never losing sight of the individuals we have become through our separate struggles and the couple we hope to become through our shared future. The exchange of rings was followed by personal vows that drew upon their unique history while looking forward to possibilities that could only be realized through continued commitment to the values that had sustained them during their darkest moments. These promises were witnessed not only by the small congregation, but by the ancient stones of the Highland Church itself, whose walls had heard similar commitments from generations of couples who understood that love was both gift and responsibility, joy and obligation, celebration and sacred trust that required daily renewal and careful tending to flourish across the years that would test every aspect of their dedication to each other and the life they hoped to build together. The modest reception that followed at MacLeod House reflected the same values that had governed the ceremony, emphasizing fellowship and genuine celebration over elaborate entertainment or expensive display, allowing the gathered company to focus on the happiness of the couple whose journey to this moment had required such patience, sacrifice, and growth. Lady Thornbury's toast captured the significance of the occasion with words that acknowledged both the trials they had endured and the hope their union represented for others who might face similar challenges. "I have watched these two young people," she said with the sort of elegant simplicity that had always characterized her speech, "learn that true love cannot be destroyed by external circumstances, but can only be strengthened by the trials that test its fundamental character. And I believe their marriage will serve as an example to others that some promises are indeed worth waiting for, some love worth any sacrifice, and some happiness worth the price of patience and faith." Her words were echoed by Mr. MacLeod's Highland blessing, which drew upon ancient traditions while acknowledging the modern realities that would shape their future together. "May your love be like the Highland mountains," he intoned with ceremonial gravity, "strong enough to weather any storm, beautiful enough to inspire wonder in all who behold it, and enduring enough to stand as a landmark for generations who will follow in your footsteps and draw courage from your example." As the afternoon faded into evening and the last guests departed with wishes for happiness and promises to visit the couple at their Northumberland estate, Alexander and Cordelia found themselves alone together for the first time as husband and wife, standing hand in hand before the fire that Mrs. MacLeod had built up to ward off the Highland chill that always seemed to intensify once darkness fell. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the sort of peaceful contentment that came from knowing they had finally reached the destination toward which they had been traveling for so many years through such difficult terrain. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to England and the work of building their life together at Ravenshollow. But tonight belonged to quiet reflection on the path that had brought them to this moment of fulfillment, and the gratitude they felt for the lessons learned through trials that had seemed at the time like nothing more than obstacles to their happiness. The firelight played across their joined hands, illuminating the sapphire ring that now symbolized not just family tradition, but personal triumph, the victory of patient love over hasty passion, mature commitment over youthful impulse, and the sort of deep understanding that could only emerge from the crucible of genuine trial and the choice to forgive, to grow, and to trust in possibilities that required courage to imagine and wisdom to achieve. 5 years had transformed Ravenshollow from the scene of scandal and financial crisis into a model estate where innovative agricultural practices and enlightened tenant relations had created prosperity that benefited everyone who lived and worked on the land that Alexander and Cordelia had chosen to make their permanent home and the foundation for the family they were building together. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the breakfast room where they sat with their 2 young children, 3-year-old William and 18-month-old Margaret, whose laughter filled the house with the sort of joy that made all their earlier struggles seem worthwhile as preparation for this season of contentment and purpose. Cordelia moved between her maternal duties and her correspondence with the natural grace that had always characterized her approach to managing multiple responsibilities, this morning dividing her attention between ensuring that little William ate his porridge properly and responding to a letter from Lady Thornbury, who had become not only beloved family friend, but trusted advisor on matters ranging from child-rearing to estate management. The garden visible through the breakfast-room windows showed the results of 5 years of careful cultivation, its formal beds now mature enough to provide both beauty and practical herbs for the household, while the wilderness area that Alexander had preserved at Cordelia's request served as a living memorial to their courtship and a playground where their children could explore nature under their parents' watchful supervision. Alexander himself had returned from his morning rounds of the estate with reports that filled him with the sort of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing long-term planning beginning to bear fruit in improved crop yields, healthier livestock, and tenant families whose children now had access to the sort of education that would prepare them for futures limited only by their own ambition and effort, rather than the circumstances of their birth. The changes at Ravenshollow reflected not just agricultural innovation, but a philosophy of stewardship that treated the estate as a community rather than merely a source of income, an approach that had gradually restored both financial stability and social respect for the Duke and Duchess, whose marriage had once been the subject of scandalous gossip, but was now regarded as an example of how true love could triumph over adversity through patience, commitment, and shared values. Society's acceptance had come gradually, but completely, helped by their obvious happiness together and their consistent demonstration of the principles they claimed to value, until their annual visits to London were marked not by whispered speculation, but by genuine warmth from friends who had learned to judge them by their character rather than their unconventional path to marriage. Their children were growing up with an understanding of both privilege and responsibility that came from parents who had learned these lessons through personal trial rather than inherited assumption. Little William already showing signs of the sort of thoughtful consideration that would serve him well as the future Duke, while Margaret displayed the independence and curiosity that promised to make her a formidable woman in her own right, regardless of what society might expect from someone of her rank and gender. On this particular morning, as autumn light filled the familiar rooms where they had created their sanctuary of love and purpose, Alexander paused in his reading of agricultural journals to watch Cordelia help their daughter with the simple wooden blocks that were teaching her colors and shapes, marveling at how the woman who had once seemed lost to him forever had become not just his wife, but his partner in every sense, sharing his dreams while contributing her own vision to the life they were building together. The sapphire ring caught the light as she moved, its deep blue depths holding all the promises they had made and kept, all the trials they had survived, and all the hope they shared for the future that stretched ahead of them with infinite possibility for continued growth, deeper love, and the sort of lasting happiness that could only be built upon the foundation of understanding, respect, and commitment that they had fought so hard to achieve and now treasured as the greatest gift their difficult journey had ultimately provided.